Ancient stories aren't just entertainment. They're maps, hidden maps. We tend to think of legendary voyages as fantasy, but they hold truths, startling truths about the planet's forgotten geography. Epic sagas like Homer's Odyssey or the Voyages of Sinbad were geographic records, astonishingly accurate ones. This gives you a new lens for human history. A lens where myth and map are the same thing. A story about a one-eyed giant preserved a coastline, a treacherous coastline. A culture would encode their sailing routes inside a hero's quest. A fantastical quest. You'll see the oldest stories differently, in a new light, a revolutionary light. This is about separating folklore from fact, finding the real landscapes behind the epic journeys. The question is which legendary tale you always thought was just a story. The oldest stories we know, they functioned like a kind of ancient technology. Before libraries, before any kind of written record, the main system for storing vital information was a living one. It was the human voice. For generation after generation, the only real method to preserve knowledge was to speak it. To sing it, to shape it into a tale so compelling it wouldn't be forgotten. That's the oral tradition, and it wasn't just for entertainment around a fire. This was about survival. The most skilled people in a community, the bards, the storytellers, they had this sacred duty. They were the living encyclopedias. They were the navigational charts, the archives for their entire people, but raw data on its own, it's fragile. A list of coordinates, some sailing instructions that fades. But a story about a hero, a story with monsters and marvels and narrow escapes, that stays with you for a lifetime. So these ancient custodians, they performed this remarkable act of encryption. They took the hard, factual truths of their world and they wrapped them in legend, that dangerous whirlpool where currents could swallow a ship that became Charybdis. A living, monstrous vortex or a narrow, turbulent strait where rocks seemed to crash together with the tide. Those became the Symplegades, the clashing rocks Jason had to get past. Or a distant island, rich with a specific mineral or resource. That might become the Golden Fleece, or the Garden of the Hesperides with its golden apples. Every fantastical element, it had this dual purpose. It captured the imagination so the story would survive, and it encoded something precise, a practical warning. Or a landmark, which means these myths were never meant to be taken literally, but they were always meant to be remembered accurately. They're like sophisticated cultural databases. Their data isn't structured in ones and zeros, it's in archetypes and adventures. The monster is the warning, the treasure is the destination, the hero's path is the safe route. And once you see that principle, these ancient narratives, they just click into focus with a new clarity. They stop being fairy tales and they start being maps. So with that key, we can start to decode a journey, our first legendary one, the oldest story we have, the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's on clay tablets from 4,000 years ago. A king, part god and part man, who's afraid of death. He goes looking for immortality, and his journey takes him to this terrifying place, the cedar forest. Guarded by a monster named Humbaba, for a long time that was read as allegory, a hero facing wild nature, the monster as chaos, the forest as the unknown. But then you look at the archaeology, the geography, and that symbolic layer starts to peel back. What's underneath is a travelogue, an accurate one. The cedar forest was a real destination. Cedar wood was a legendary resource, strong, fragrant, valuable, used for temples, palaces, ships. The nearest major source for Mesopotamia, where the story comes from, was the Amanus Mountains. In what's now southern Turkey and Lebanon, that was a known trade route. Sumerian and Akkadian merchants would go north, cross the Euphrates, navigate mountain passes. All for that timber, so you read the epic again. Gilgamesh and his companion Encoded, they're not just wandering, they're on a specific, difficult journey. The text mentions crossing 7 mountains, fording great waters, a long road. Those details line up, point for point, with the actual geography, the trade corridors. Then the monster Humbaba changes. He's not just a guardian of nature. He could be the real dangers of that expedition, the perilous terrain, the hostile local tribes protecting their resources. The scale of those ancient forests, to someone from the open plains, that would feel monstrous, alive. So it's not a story about conquering nature in the abstract. It's a cultural memory, encoded in verse, about conquering distance and danger for survival. The quest for immortality is mirrored by the quest for a material that gives a different permanence. Cedar wood built the structures that defined a civilization. That's a lasting legacy. The epic had a dual purpose, a thrilling tale of heroism and loss. And also a reinforced record, a way to remember why cedar was important and exactly how far you had to go, what you might face to get it. The map was hidden in the myth. And the first ones to follow it weren't archaeologists. They were lumberjacks and merchants, guided by a 4,000-year-old poem. From the ancient cedar forests, we go to another text. Homer's Odyssey. It's a story about a hero trying to get home, but it's also an ancient sailor's logbook, disguised as a supernatural story. People remember the Cyclops, Circe, the sirens. For an ancient Greek sailor, those weren't just entertainment. They were data, warnings. Take the most terrifying part, the strait between Scylla and Charybdis. A 6-headed monster on one side, a whirlpool on the other. For centuries, that was myth. Then you see the Strait of Messina between Italy and Sicily. The geography matches. It's a narrow, treacherous pass, violent currents. On one side, sharp rocks coming from the cliffs. To a sailor, those could look like heads reaching down. On the other side, tidal conditions create swirling eddies, a whirlpool. Navigating that real strait with a clear left-side danger and a right-side danger is the exact dilemma Homer describes. Scylla and Charybdis aren't random. They're a poetic way to say, navigate this specific strait with caution. You can't avoid danger here. You have to choose the lesser peril. This pattern keeps going. The land of the lotus eaters, where crewmen eat a fruit and forget home, is often linked to Jerba off North Africa, known for its lush fruits. A place where ships could be stuck for weeks by weather, a place that could make you forget your journey. The description fits, even Odysseus's home, Ithaca. Homer describes it as low-lying, west of another island, fit for goats, not horses. Modern Ithaca matches that, west of larger Kephallonia. The epic's sailing directions and timelines between places like Troy and the Peloponnese often match real wind patterns and travel times for Bronze Age ships. So what this means is the Odyssey probably worked as a cultural database of Mediterranean geography. Each generation of storytellers added layers. They encoded discoveries and warnings from real voyages into the story of Odysseus's journey. The supernatural parts were memory devices. You might forget coordinates, but you wouldn't forget the story of a one-eyed giant who ate men, or witches who turned sailors into swine. Those stories marked locations, strange, isolated communities, or dangerous, cave-ridden coastlines to avoid. The poem wasn't a literal map, but it was a functional one. It taught young sailors what to expect, how long journeys might take, where the greatest dangers were, all wrapped in a story so compelling it was preserved for centuries. The fantasy was the packaging, the Mediterranean was the product. These coded maps weren't just for one story, they belonged to something bigger, a tradition that covered the whole known world. And one of the biggest of those legendary trips was Jason and the Argonauts, the quest for the Golden Fleece. On the surface, it's an adventure. A crew of heroes on a ship called the Argo, facing impossible tasks to get a magical treasure. But underneath, it's a detailed record, one of the most important economic journeys of the ancient world, the opening of the Black Sea trade routes. Jason's journey has a clear start and a clear end. He sails from Greece to a distant land called Kolchis. That's the eastern shore of the Black Sea in modern Georgia. This wasn't a random fantasy. For the early Greeks, the Black Sea, the Pontus, was a frontier. A huge, mysterious sea surrounded by unfamiliar people, but it was also a place of huge wealth: gold, timber, grain. The fleece itself is a clue. In Kolchis, historical records show they used sheepskins to pan for gold in mountain streams. The fleece would trap the gold dust, so a golden fleece wasn't just a symbol, it was a literal description, a valuable local technology, a technology tied to a specific, faraway place. Now Jason's route, the myth lists his stops, and they line up almost perfectly with the real choke points a Greek ship would have to pass to reach that wealth. First, the Hellespont, that's the Dardanelles Strait, the narrow entrance from the Aegean into the Sea of Marmara, a real and difficult passage. Then, the Symplegades. The clashing rocks, two cliffs that would crash together and destroy any ship. Scholars link this to the Bosporus, the final strait into the Black Sea. The currents there are fierce, unpredictable, rocks and swirling water that could crush a vessel. The myth says Jason sent a dove ahead. If it passed, the rocks would freeze open long enough for the Argo to follow. That sounds like a coded instruction. Watch for the right moment in the tidal flow. Time your passage carefully. A navigational warning turned into a scene. Once in the Black Sea, the journey east follows the southern coast, a known trade corridor, and the final destination is the river Phasis. That's the modern Rioni River in Georgia, which was a major entry point into the interior. The geography is precise, so the Argonautica isn't just a tall tale. It's a cultural project, a way to package the collective experience of early Greek explorers and traders into one heroic story. Every monster, every strange tribe Jason meets likely represents a real hazard or a cultural encounter from those early voyages. The story codified the dangers, the wonders, and the rewards of going into the Pontic region. It turned geography into legend, and by doing that, it served a purpose. It encouraged more exploration. It made sailing to the ends of the known world seem not just possible, but glorious. The myth was the advertisement, and the map was the reality. The idea of these encoded journeys, it wasn't just a Mediterranean thing. You find them in the oldest stories from all over. Like the Exodus, it's a story about liberation, a covenant, a 40-year walk through a huge, punishing desert. For thousands of years, people have read it as sacred history, as theology. But inside the verses, there's something else, a detailed guide for surviving one of the toughest places on the planet. The route it gives from the Nile Delta across a body of water into the Sinai wilderness, that's a real ancient travel corridor. The coastal road to the north was full of Egyptian soldiers, so going south, inland, through the mountain desert, that was the smart move. It's not a random path. It's a path through a specific, brutal landscape, and the text is full of these hyper-specific problems and solutions that fit that exact place, like at Mara. The people find bitter water undrinkable, and Moses is told to throw a piece of wood into it to make it sweet. To us, that's a miracle. To a desert traveler, it sounds like chemistry. Some springs in the Sinai have a high mineral content. The water turns alkaline and bitter. Throwing certain wood or bark in can cause a reaction. It pulls some minerals out, makes the taste better. It's a survival trick written down as a divine act. Then there's the manna, the mysterious bread from heaven that came with the dew. People have pointed out a natural thing in the Sinai. A certain tamarisk tree, when an insect pierces it, it oozes a sweet, resinous stuff. It drips, hardens overnight. It's edible, full of carbs, and it spoils fast in the heat. The biblical description appearing on the ground like frost, gathered in the morning, spoiling if you kept it, it matches that natural event almost exactly. It's not a supernatural food, it's a precise observation of a desert resource. Even the search for the mountain itself, Mount Sinai. The story talks about a towering, fearsome peak with smoke and fire. The places they suggest, like Jebel Musa or Jebel al-Lawz, they aren't just random hills, they're the most prominent, awe-inspiring mountains in that whole region. Their isolation, their dramatic look, it would naturally create a profound spiritual experience. The story holds the memory of a real, identifiable landmark, reached after a very long trip. So this means the Exodus narrative works on a few levels. On one, it's this deep story of faith and identity. On another, it's a layered record of geography and ecology. The trials in the wilderness, finding water, finding food, navigating by landmarks, those were the universal trials of surviving that desert. By weaving these survival steps into a grand, sacred story, the community made sure that critical environmental knowledge wouldn't disappear. The story became the container, the desert wisdom was the cargo inside. It turned a map of hardship into a map of meaning, so even the knowledge of which tree to tap for food would travel safely for centuries. The Irish had these voyage tales, the Imrama. They weren't about trade or running away, they were journeys of faith. Monks wrote them out on the edge of everything. One of the most famous is Saint Brendan the Navigator. He goes out in a leather boat, a carrach, with a group of brothers. They're looking for the promised land of the saints. A paradise somewhere in the west. What he describes seems impossible. A floating crystal pillar, an island that's a mountain of fire, a sea that's thick like it's curdled. For a long time, people thought it was allegory, a metaphor for the soul, but then you look at it like a sailor. You look at a map of the North Atlantic. And it starts to make a different kind of sense, that crystal pillar. If you'd never seen an iceberg, a massive one breaking off a glacier, shining, it would look like a moving crystal cathedral, a mountain of fire that's a volcano, like in Iceland. That curdled sea could be the Sargasso Sea, all dense with seaweed. Or it could be where currents meet and the water gets choppy and foamy. He talks about islands of birds, a huge noise that matches the seabird colonies. On cliffs in places like the Faroe Islands, the geography fits, the natural things fit. So the idea is, these Irish monks weren't just dreaming, they were sailing. From their remote monasteries, they were pushing out into the ocean, island hopping, and these stories were their guides. The account of Brendan's voyage, the Navigatio. It reads like a pilot's log. It talks about sailing for 40 days, which is about how long it might take to get certain places with the winds back then. There's a part about celebrating Easter on the back of a whale, a strange detail, but it could be a memory coded, making landfall on something stable, floating in an empty ocean. A chance to stop. Every strange thing in the story becomes a landmark, a waypoint. These tales preserved navigational knowledge, Celtic seafaring knowledge. About currents, about when to sail, where to find fresh water on islands. It was survival data, wrapped inside a divine mission, and that leads to a bigger possibility. If these are records and not just legends, then it means something extraordinary. These Irish monks might have been crossing the Atlantic long before the Vikings. Long before Columbus, they might have reached North America and called it their promised land. The spiritual quest and the exploration were the same thing. The myth was the container, it carried the map, so when a monk told the story of Saint Brendan, he was doing more than telling a holy tale. He was keeping a sailing manual. For the very edge of the world, this wasn't just an Atlantic thing. You see it in the Indian Ocean too, but the stories there aren't about saints, they're about merchants. Sinbad the Sailor from the 1001 Nights, they read like fantasy. A giant bird that carries elephants, a valley full of diamonds, a mountain that pulls the nails from your ship. For a long time, that's all they were, wonderful, impossible stories, but they're also something more. They're like encrypted logbooks from the Abbasid Empire's golden age of trade. Sinbad leaves from Basra, a real port on the Persian Gulf, and his 7 voyages, they follow real routes, the trade web, connecting the Islamic world to East Africa, to India, all the way to China. These were the real superhighways traveled by real merchants. So take the Valley of Diamonds. Sinbad describes this deep gorge, glittering with stones guarded by snakes. To get them, merchants would throw meat down. Eagles would take the meat with diamonds stuck to it back to their nests, where the merchants could collect them. It sounds absurd, but for centuries there were reports from travelers like Marco Polo of diamond mines in India where they used similar methods. The story takes a real trade good, Indian diamonds, and a real, or at least believed, way of getting them, and wraps it in a survival tale. It's a memory device. It encodes where the wealth is and the strange, dangerous process to get it, or the magnetic mountain. A place so strong it pulls the iron from a ship could be a warning about a real coastline with magnetic anomalies that wreck your compass, or a metaphor for the powerful draw of a wealthy port, a place that could make your fortune. Even the giant rock, a bird so big it blocks the sun, that might come from reality. Sailors from Madagascar might have seen the elephant bird, a huge, flightless creature, or stories of a large African eagle. The fantasy anchors a real place. The distant islands off the African coast. So these 7 voyages had 2 purposes. Like the Odyssey, for the listener, they were entertainment, but for a young merchant, a sailor, they were an informal encyclopedia. A compendium of geographic knowledge. They gave the waypoints: sail here, watch for that current. They listed the goods: diamonds here, spices there. And they offered a crude ethnography, the customs, the dangers of dealing with foreign peoples. The Sinbad stories preserved the collective intelligence of that trading network. They turned facts about monsoons and prices into a saga of risk and reward. They taught that the path to fortune was perilous, full of natural wonders and human treachery. The fantasy was the shell, the map of the world was the kernel inside. Those sea legends like Sinbad or Brendan, they all used stories to carry maps. But the most advanced system didn't rely on parchment or poems alone. It used the night sky. You have to look to the Pacific, to the greatest open water explorers we've ever known. The Polynesians, their world was the ocean, this unimaginable expanse of blue, and their hero was Maui, a demigod whose stories seem like pure magic. He fished islands up from the deep. He lassoed the sun to slow it down. On the surface, these are creation myths, tales of cosmic power, but listen to them as a navigator would. A master wayfinder heading out in a double-hulled canoe. Then the magic turns into geography. When the story says Maui fished up an island, that island has a name. A shape, a position relative to other islands he pulled up. Te Ika a Maui, the fish of Maui, that's the North Island of New Zealand. Its head, its tail, its fin, they're all specific landmarks. This wasn't just a children's tale, it was a relational database, a way to remember that this large island, shaped like a fish, lies in a specific direction from home. It preserved the spatial relationships between places separated by hundreds of miles of open ocean. But the stories were just one layer. The true genius was how they connected to the stars. For Polynesian navigators, the myths of Maui were tied to the star paths. The constellations weren't just pretty lights, they were characters in a story that never ended. The sky was a dome. Each star or constellation rose and set at a fixed point on the horizon, like a celestial compass. The story of Maui snaring the sun, for example, links to knowledge of the sun's changing path across the sky through the year. Knowing exactly where the sun would rise during seasonal migrations was critical. The legends gave you the memorable narrative. The practiced navigator knew which star rose directly over which island. To sail to Tahiti, you followed the star called Sirius. That was your guidepost. The story of a hero's journey to the underworld might be tied to the constellation Scorpio, which pointed the way south. It created a seamless system. The myth gave you the why and the what, the identity of the destination. The star knowledge gave you the precise how, the exact path to get there. Young navigators learned through chants, through stories, through hours of observation. They memorized swell patterns, bird migrations, the color of clouds over distant land. And all of this practical knowledge was anchored by the Epic of Maui. It was all one piece, a mnemonic device of breathtaking scale. This is how, centuries before Europeans dared to lose sight of land, Polynesians consistently found specks of land in an ocean covering a third of the planet. They settled islands from Hawaii to Rapa Nui to Aotearoa, not by accident but by design, guided by stories that were, in their essence, the most accurate maps ever made. Maps written not on paper but in the stars and sung across generations. The fantasy of a demigod pulling up land was the packaging, the precise longitudinal and latitudinal knowledge needed to actually find that land. That was the profound truth inside. These maps weren't just in the Pacific, they were in the north too, in the ice, in the Sagas. For a long time, the Viking voyages west were just stories. Told in Iceland, stories about a place called Vinland, far west of Greenland, a place with wild grapes and salmon in the rivers and good grass. It sounded like a dream. A better land. The Sagas, like the Greenlander's saga, gave the details. They named people, Leif Erikson, his brother Thorvald, their sister Freydis. They described the route, sailing west from Greenland, past a land of flat stones, Helluland, then a forested coast, Markland, then finally Vinland. They talked about building camps, meeting the local people, the Skraelings. Sometimes they traded, sometimes there was conflict. For centuries, people argued, was Vinland a legend, a paradise story? Or was it real? Then, in the 1960s, something happened. In Newfoundland, in Canada, archaeologists found a settlement. It wasn't native, it was Norse. The site was Elant's Ox Meadows. They found 8 building foundations, the kind Vikings built, a bronze pin, a stone lamp, iron nails, and they found evidence of iron working. Something the local people didn't have. This was proof, physical proof. Carbon dating put it around the year 1000 AD, exactly when Leif Erikson was said to have sailed. And then the stories made sense. Helluland, the flat stones, that was Baffin Island. Markland, the forests, that was Labrador. And Vinland was the northern coast of Newfoundland. Maybe farther south, the Saga's description of the coast, long beaches, tidal lagoons, it fit Newfoundland. Even the wild grapes, vinber, that could have been berries. Or vines that grew there 1,000 years ago. The stories about the Skraelings, the difficult encounters, those were real too. The archaeology shows the Norse weren't alone there. The ancestors of the Beothuk and Micmac were there. The Sagas kept the memory of that first contact. That changes how you read them. The Norse Sagas weren't just stories. They were a living memory, a memory of a geographic discovery. They were oral history passed down before being written in Iceland. They kept the sailing directions, the descriptions of resources, the warnings about the people there. They were a functional record, a map for later, in case anyone ever sailed west again. Elant's Ox Meadows proved the Vikings reached America, and it proved their legends were true, not in every detail but in their core, as records of exploration. The saga was the container, and the map to a new continent was inside, waiting for 1,000 years for someone to believe the story and go find the place. Elant's Ox Meadows tells us a legend can be a map, but what if the map points to a different ocean, the Pacific? There are ancient Chinese texts. One of them is about a place called Fusang, a land far to the east past the Eastern Ocean. It's in old books like the classic of mountains and seas, and then there's a later report from a Buddhist monk. His name was Hui Shen. He came to the Chinese court in the late 5th century. He said he had been there to Fusang. His account is very specific. He says it's 20,000 li east of China. A place with huge trees, Fusang trees, so big they built houses from them. The people there had writing. They made paper from tree bark. They had a society with a ruler with nobles. They kept deer for milk. They had a kind of copper, but they didn't have iron. For a long time, that was just a story, a fable. But then you look at the map. You look at the Pacific currents, the Kuroshio current, the Black Current. It moves east from China, past Japan, across the northern Pacific. That current could take a boat all the way to the Americas. To the northwest coast, now the details, giant trees for houses, that fits the redwoods, the sequoias, the cultures there built houses from giant planks. Paper from bark, that was done there by some indigenous peoples, raising deer, not for milk but deer were central, and the copper, no iron, that matches pre-Columbian America. They worked copper, they didn't smelt iron. There are too many parallels, it can't just be coincidence. So the theory is that Fusang might be a conflation. A memory built from real contact, maybe fishermen blown off course, traders. Their stories got filtered through time, through Chinese cosmology. They became the land of Fusang. Hui Shen's report might not be a direct travelogue. It might be a compilation, sailors' stories, distant reports, woven together into one narrative for the court. It shows something, this idea of putting geography into myth. It wasn't just a Mediterranean thing or an Atlantic thing. Asian civilizations did it too. With their own trade networks, their own curiosity about the sea, the Fusang stories kept an idea alive that there was something out there beyond the Eastern Ocean. A place with resources, different people, a different way of life. Whether Fusang was California or Mexico or a mix of ideas, that's still argued, but the core idea holds. The story was a placeholder, a mythological file folder labeled distant land to the east. Waiting for the day when the actual geography would be known, it was a map drawn with clues about trees, customs, resources, a map written in the language of legend. The most ambitious journeys, they weren't just recorded, they got bigger. Their edges turned into legend, and Alexander the Great, his shadow is one of the longest. His actual campaigns went from Greece all the way to India. It was a geographic shockwave, but after he died, that history got absorbed into something else. A huge collection of stories, the Alexander Romance. In these stories, Alexander doesn't just conquer kingdoms. He travels to the ends of the earth. He finds talking trees. He builds a wall to lock away monstrous nations. It sounds like pure fantasy, but woven through all the marvels, there's a map, a surprisingly accurate one. It comes from the memories of thousands of soldiers who marched with him. Think about the setting for one of his famous mythical acts. The story says Alexander built a great iron gate in distant mountains to trap the terrifying hordes of Gog and Magog. For medieval Europe and the Islamic world, that was a real place on their maps, a literal barrier at the edge of civilization. Now scholars, they see its roots in something tangible. During his northern campaigns, Alexander had fortifications built in the Caucasus region, a real barrier against real steppe tribes. Over centuries, the memory of that strategic wall changed. Built by a legendary conqueror in a faraway mountain pass, the specific tribes became the apocalyptic nations of Gog and Magog. The tactical barrier became a divine one. The legend preserved a geographic truth. Alexander was here at this rugged frontier, and he built something to hold the unknown back. This pattern repeats all through the Romance, the descriptions of the Gedrosian desert. That was a real crossing, a horrific one. Alexander's army suffered terribly there. In that merciless wasteland, the legend kept that memory alive. It emphasized the scale, the danger, the accounts of the Indus River Valley, with its huge cities and strange animals. They align with what his expedition actually saw. Even the Caucasus Mountains, they're described with a realism that could only come from first-hand experience. The fantasy was a vessel. It carried the sheer geographic scope of Alexander's empire into the popular imagination, long after the empire itself was gone. So the Alexander romance did something remarkable. It took the dry, strategic facts of a military campaign and turned them into a universal adventure. A soldier's memory of a brutal desert march became a chapter about surviving the ends of the earth. A report about a mountain fortress became a myth about holding back chaos. The real places Caucasus, Gedrosia, Indus, they became anchors, coordinates in a story that was told and retold, from Ireland to Indonesia, that ensured the geographic knowledge gained at such a high cost wasn't lost. It was just translated from history into legend, and that legendary map, it would guide cartographers for 1,000 years and misguide them. These maps didn't only mark coastlines. They were recording the ground shaking, breaking. In these stories, the world is often unstable, lands that vanish, great floods that wipe everything away. These aren't just metaphors. In many cases, they're literal memories, echoes of real trauma, witnessed by ancient people and preserved the only way they could be as story. Think of the most common myth, the Great Flood. It's in the Epic of Gilgamesh, in the Bible, in Hindu texts, in stories from indigenous peoples across the Americas. For a long time, that was seen as a shared theological idea, but it could be a shared physical experience. Geologists point to the end of the last ice age. Glaciers melted, global sea levels rose by hundreds of feet over centuries. For coastal communities, the ocean didn't creep in, it swallowed their world. What had been a valley, a hunting ground, a home, became the seafloor. That loss, that relentless water, would be the defining event for generations. It would become the flood, a story told inland by the descendants, the details. A hero, a boat, animals, that's the narrative frame. The core truth is the water. The memory of a drowned homeland. This pattern gets more specific. Take the Greek story of Atlantis, a powerful island kingdom that sank in a day and a night. For centuries, it was the ultimate lost world. Then archaeologists looked at the Aegean. Around 1600 BCE, the volcanic island of Thera exploded. That's Santorini now. It was one of the largest eruptions in human history. The center of the island collapsed into the sea. It created a massive caldera. Tsunamis, hundreds of feet high, radiated out. They devastated the coast of Crete, the heart of the Minoan civilization. Ash blotted out the sun. The Minoan world, a sophisticated maritime power, was crippled. To the Greeks who came later, hearing fragments about this advanced culture that just disappeared, the conclusion was mythic. A whole island with its palaces and people consumed by the waves. The story of Atlantis isn't a philosopher's invention. It's likely a cultural heirloom, a garbled, amplified memory of a real cataclysm, one that reshaped the Mediterranean. The journey to find Atlantis is, in a way, a journey back to a geological crime scene. So these myths of sinking lands and rising waters, they do more than warn of divine anger. They are data points. When a legend from the Pacific describes a long land bridge that once connected islands, geologists can look for submerged ridges. When a Native American story tells of a mountain that stood where a lake now is, it might reference a landslide or a volcanic caldera. The journey in the myth often navigates a landscape shaped by violence. A hero crosses a plain that was once a sea. He climbs a mountain that legends say was thrown there by gods. These aren't arbitrary set pieces, they are narrative fingerprints. Of earthquakes, eruptions, shifting coastlines. By listening to these stories with the ear of a geologist, we can sometimes pinpoint past disasters. The myth becomes a temporal landmark. It tells us not just where, but when the earth moved. It turns the epic journey into a path through deep time, where every strange terrain feature is a clue to a planet's turbulent history. The fantasy of a sinking city is the shell. The memory of a real, world-altering explosion is the truth held inside. Carried across 100 generations, for the ancient Celts, the landscape was a gateway. They saw doors in the hills and lakes. Their world was layered with a parallel realm right beside ours, the other world. You didn't reach it by sailing far away. You might find it through a familiar mound in a field or a still pool in a local forest that created a different kind of map. A sacred geography, every feature of the land held a dual meaning. The tales from the Welsh Mabinogion, they don't happen in some vague, fictional place. They happen in specific, real locations you can still visit. A hero is guided to a court inside a hill, and that hill has a name. It's a real tumulus, an ancient burial mound. The story anchors the supernatural event to a tangible spot in the Welsh countryside. It turns geography into narrative. When you hear a king rules from Gorsedd Arbeth, you're not just hearing a setting. You're being given a coordinate for wonder. This is even clearer with the Irish Ows Shee, the people of the mounds, the Shia. Their homes are the Shia mounds, those ancient grassy hillocks across the landscape. These weren't random fairy tales, they were explanations and protections. A farmer would know not to disturb that particular mound on his land, because the story said a powerful being lived there. The myth enforced a real-world respect. It preserved the site, the story was the fence. The journeys to these places follow a specific logic. A hero doesn't sail west for 40 days. He steps into a mist on a known path, or he's invited across a threshold that appears only at dusk. The transition is sudden, but the destination is often a mirror or an inversion of the world he left. This encodes a profound idea. The spiritual realm isn't somewhere else, it's here, interwoven with the physical. Your daily walk to the river might, under the right conditions, become a passage to another reality. This belief system created a deeply intimate map. It meant knowing every fold of the land wasn't just about navigation or resources. It was about understanding the spiritual currents flowing beneath it. Which spring was a place of healing? Which grove was a place of meeting? The myths answered these questions by tying them to landmarks. So the journey to the Celtic otherworld was, in a real sense, the ultimate act of local orientation. It taught that the greatest adventures weren't across unknown seas. They were hidden within the known valleys and hills of home. The epic was hyper-local. The fantasy of a fairy kingdom was the shell, the precise, reverential knowledge of your own homeland, its archaeology, its ecology, its quiet beauty. That was the profound truth inside the tale. It turned every person into a cartographer of the unseen. That intimate map of the Celtic hills, it finds its final form in another kind of sacred journey. One that didn't just point toward a spiritual realm, it mapped the actual geography of enlightenment. The life of Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha. It's maybe the deepest spiritual story we have. But if you set the doctrine aside and just look at the shape of it, it's a journey, a specific geographic journey from a palace in Kapilavastu to a grove in Lumbini, to a tree in Bodh Gaya, to a deer park in Sarnath, and finally to a town, Kushinagar. These aren't mythical places, they're precise points on a map. For centuries, those names were kept in oral tradition. In chants, in the polycanon texts, monks memorized them, pilgrims looked for them. Long before any archaeology, these sites were real destinations because the story said they were. The spiritual narrative created a perfect geographic record. Think about a pilgrim 1,000 years ago. You wouldn't have a guidebook, you would have the story. You would know the Buddha was born in Lumbini under a sal tree, so you'd travel there to that region, asking for directions to the Garden of Lumbini. You would know he reached enlightenment under a bodhi tree in Bodh Gaya. so your journey would take you to that specific village to find that specific tree or what grew from it. The story gave you the destinations, the oral tradition from other travelers gave you the routes between them. This network of sites, Lumbini, Bodh Gaya, Sarnath, Kushinagar, it became a circuit. A literal path to walk, and by walking it you weren't just touring, you were retracing the teacher's footsteps, you were connecting doctrine to dirt. Enlightenment to earth, the landscape itself became a teaching, a reminder of impermanence, of struggle, of peace. Then in the 19th century, something happened. British archaeologists, working with local guides and ancient texts like the accounts of the Chinese pilgrim Xuanzang, they started to dig. They were following the same map. The stories led them to overgrown mounds, forgotten villages, and at each spot they found proof. At Lumbini, an ancient stone pillar put up by Emperor Ashoka, inscribed with the confirmation that this was the Buddha's birthplace. At Bodh Gaya, the remains of the original Mahabodhi temple complex around the sacred Bodhi tree. At Sarnath, stupas and inscriptions marking the deer park where the first sermon was given. At Kushinagar, the site of his final resting place, the legend wasn't a metaphor, it was a blueprint. The spiritual biography had worked for over 2,000 years as a flawless geographic guide. The doctrine and the map were a single thing. It shows you something about how deep knowledge survives. It isn't just written down, it is walked. It's woven into the geography of belief, so that every step a pilgrim takes reinforces the memory. And every sacred site anchors the story to the real, tangible world. The medieval world map, the Mappa Mundi, took that idea to its most complex form. It's drawn on parchment. To us now, these maps look strange. The shapes are wrong, the oceans are small, the whole thing is inside a circle, but that's because we're looking for geography. And that wasn't the point was the soul. At the absolute center of every one of these maps you find Jerusalem, not as a geographic fact, but as the spiritual center. Everything else radiates out from there. East is at the top, where they'd often draw paradise as a walled garden. The three continents, Europe, Africa, Asia, they're arranged around the Mediterranean like petals. This was a diagram of salvation, a spiritual layout, but within that symbolic frame they packed what they thought was real knowledge, and a lot of that knowledge came from those legendary journeys. You look at the edges of the map. In the far east you might see Alexander's Wall holding back Gog and Magog. Out in the Western Ocean, the island of St. Brendan's promised land. The stories of Sinbad might put strange beasts in Africa. The tales of Prester John place a Christian kingdom in Asia. These weren't just decorations. They were data. The mapmakers used every source they had: scripture, classical texts like Pliny, the reports from merchants and pilgrims. They were building a complete picture of creation. A single world view where faith and geography were the same thing. The ultimate expression of this was the pilgrimage, the journey to that center, to Jerusalem. For a medieval person, this was the great undertaking of a lifetime. A dangerous trek across land and sea, and the Mappa Mundi was a preparation for that. It showed the pilgrim not just the route but the meaning of the route, how every step moved them closer to the center of their faith. So the map and the legend created a kind of hybrid reality. Part theology, part aggregated exploration data. When a pilgrim set out, they carried two maps. One was a practical itinerary, probably crude. The other was this rich symbolic landscape in their mind, filled with wonders and monsters from 1,000 stories. So the journey was layered. They were navigating real forests, real mountains, but they were also walking through a living legend, where a distant mountain range might be the home of a giant. Where a river might flow from paradise itself. That fusion gave them context, it gave them courage, it turned a grueling trip into a sacred story they were now inside. The Mappa Mundi proves a map is never just a representation of space. It's a representation of what a culture believes, what it fears, what it hopes to find. It's a story drawn in coastlines and cities, and for centuries that story, woven from myth and fragmented truth, was the only world they knew. A map of faith can also be a map of loss. There's a story from the Arabian desert, a warning. It's in the Quran and in the older Bedouin folklore, a city of incredible wealth built on pillars. Called Iram, its people grew arrogant, lost in their own power, and so, the story goes, it was wiped from the earth, swallowed by the sands. For over 1,000 years, that tale was a parable. A lesson about hubris, a geographic ghost, a place that existed only to teach a moral, not a place you could find. Then, in the 1990s, something changed. A team of researchers had a different idea. They began to treat the legend not as fiction, but as a corrupted memory, a clue. They combined the ancient texts with something else, the living oral traditions of the Bedouin tribes. Those tribes had stories, too, of a lost city out in the dunes. They called it Yubar, and they spoke of a great trade road, a road for frankincense. Frankincense was the key. In the ancient world, this resin was worth more than gold. Burned in temples from Rome to Babylon, the trees grew only in a few places like southern Oman and Yemen. To get it to market, caravans had to cross the most brutal desert, and those caravans needed stopping points, oases, fortified cities. The researchers realized Iram, or Yubar, wasn't just a city of sin. It was likely a city of trade, a crucial hub on the frankincense road, a place of immense, tangible wealth that could become legendary, so they went looking. They used new tools, satellite imagery that could see beneath the sand, and the images revealed something, faint lines like ancient wheel ruts converging from different directions in the desert. Camel caravan tracks frozen in time, all leading to one spot. In the remote Omani desert, they began to dig, and they found it. Not a city of literal pillars, but a fortress. Built atop a massive limestone cavern that held a water source, they found towers, walls, pottery, trade with the Roman Empire. This was Yubar. The city's end was not a sudden, divine cataclysm. The archaeology told a slower story. The very cavern that provided its life, the water, eventually collapsed. The ground gave way. The city fell into the sinkhole it depended on, and the desert sands did the rest. It vanished within a generation or two. To the caravans that later passed by, or the tribes that heard the story, it must have seemed like a punishment. A city of arrogance swallowed whole. The discovery did something. It took a brief, mythic verse from a holy text and grounded it in stone and sand. The parable was true, but its truth was layered. The arrogance might have been real, the pride of a city that controlled a fortune. The destruction was real, a dramatic geological collapse. The story preserved the memory of that place for over a millennium. It kept the name alive as a warning until the tools existed to go and find its physical echo. The legend was the container. The map to a lost metropolis of incense and wealth was the truth held inside, waiting in the deep desert for its story to be read not as a sermon, but as a guide. There was this letter. It started going around in the 12th century across Europe. It was addressed to the Byzantine emperor, and it claimed to be from a king and priest, Prester John. A ruler of almost unimaginable power, he described his kingdom as a paradise, a Christian realm of such splendor, it made Europe look poor. He wrote of a river of stones, a fountain of youth, subjects who lived for centuries, palaces with roofs made of gems, strange, half-human creatures at the edges of his domain, and he declared his intent to march west. To aid his fellow Christians in their struggles, for a Europe locked in the Crusades, this was electrifying. A mighty Christian ally was out there, somewhere beyond the lands held by their Muslim rivals. The letter was a forgery, of course, a piece of political fiction, but it tapped into a deep, desperate hope, and that hope turned a story into a destination. For the next 400 years, the search for Prester John's kingdom became a driving force. It provided a concrete goal. It wasn't just about finding new trade routes for spices, though that was part of it. It was a sacred quest, a mission to find this lost brother in faith. The problem was no one knew where his kingdom actually was. The original letter placed it vaguely in the Indies, India or Central Asia, but travelers like Marco Polo returned with detailed accounts of Asia. They found no trace of a Christian emperor ruling there. So the map of the legend had to shift. The kingdom couldn't be in a known place. It had to be just beyond the edge of the known world. And as Portuguese caravels began pushing down the west coast of Africa in the 15th century, a new candidate emerged. Rumors from Arab traders spoke of a powerful Christian kingdom in the interior of Africa, beyond the Sahara. This, the Portuguese reasoned, must be it. Prester John's realm was relocated, no longer in the distant east but in the mysterious south. The legend now pointed directly at the real and very much existing Ethiopian empire. This is where a fictional journey began to chart a very real coastline. Portuguese explorers, armed with this belief, were not just mapping for trade. They were on a reconnaissance mission for a holy alliance. Prince Henry the Navigator and the captains who followed him were explicitly tasked with finding a sea route to Prester John. To outflank the Muslim control of overland routes and join forces, every river mouth, every promontory they mapped brought them closer to this imagined ally. When the explorer Pero de Covilhã finally reached Ethiopia in the 1490s, he sent back a report. It confirmed a Christian monarch ruled there. The Portuguese court was jubilant. They had found him. The legend had led them to a real, powerful, and isolated Christian kingdom. This belief directly motivated Vasco da Gama's epic voyage around the Cape of Good Hope a few years later. His mission was to reach India, yes, but a key strategic objective was to make contact with Prester John from the seaward side, to cement an alliance. The fictional letters created a geopolitical phantom, and generations of sailors risked their lives to chase its shadow across real oceans. They mapped the African coast in detail for the first time in European history. Not merely out of curiosity, but in pursuit of a myth. The legend provided the why, the explorers filled in the how, and in doing so, they connected two worlds that had been separated for a millennium. The map of Africa was drawn, in part, by the coordinates of a story that was never true, but it was powerful enough to become a self-fulfilling prophecy. The fantasy of a gem-encrusted palace was the shell. The meticulous nautical charts of the African shoreline were the profound, unintended truth created inside. That phantom kingdom was built from words, but sometimes the map isn't in the journey. It's in the name of the place. A name can be a fossil, a linguistic fossil holding a memory older than any written record. When a story survives for centuries, the names inside it, for a river, a mountain, they outlast the empires that made them. They become anchors. They tether the myth to a real landscape, long after everyone's forgotten why. Take the Atlas Mountains in North Africa. The name comes from the Titan, Atlas, who held up the sky. Why would a mountain range in Africa carry a Greek name? It's a clue, a cultural collision. Greek travelers reached that far western region, and they saw these immense sky-scraping peaks. They were the pillars at the edge of their known world. The myth of Atlas provided the perfect metaphor. They named the mountains after him. That act linked the geography to a story from a distant culture. The landscape absorbed the myth, and the name stuck, becoming its own kind of truth. The mountain didn't just resemble the Titan's burden, it became it in the imagination. Then there's the river Styx, the boundary of the Greek underworld. Its name means hateful or gloomy. Its waters were said to be fatal. Scholars note that several real rivers in the ancient world, ones associated with dark rituals or believed to be poisonous, had similar names. It suggests the mythical Styx wasn't a pure invention. It was likely an amplification, an amplification of a real, fearsome waterway, a river whose strange properties, maybe a mineral content or a location near a volcanic vent, earned it a reputation. That terrifying reputation was then projected onto the ultimate boundary, the river of death itself. The name carried the memory of a real place's danger into the heart of the afterlife. This pattern is global. In Norse myth, the icy realm of Niflheim finds its echo in place names across Scandinavia, names with elements like Nifl, meaning mist or fog. These are locations known for perpetually gloomy, cold weather. The mythic land of the dead was a poetic map of the most forbidding climatic zones the Norse knew. By analyzing the roots of these names' etymology, linguists trace journeys, not of heroes but of peoples and ideas. You find a cluster of place names in Britain with Celtic roots related to a specific god. You can overlay that on a map of ancient Celtic settlement. The stories faded but the names remained, like signposts in a forgotten language. A valley might be called the Hollow of the Old God. A hill might be the Fairy Fort. These aren't just pretty phrases, they're direct lines back to the beliefs of the people who first named that spot thousands of years ago. They tell us what they saw there, what they feared, what they revered. The name itself is the surviving fragment of a lost map, a map that didn't chart physical distance but sacred space. So the next time you hear a strange place name, consider it. It might be the last remnant of a legendary journey, the final, unshakable piece of a geographic record. A record that refused to be forgotten long after the story around it turned to dust. Names can be fossils, but some maps are sung. Across Australia, the oldest continuous culture holds a different record. Not written down, held in memory, in melody. That's the dreaming. Calling it a myth misunderstands it. It's a framework for all existence. In the dreaming, ancestral beings woke. Giant serpents, emu men, kangaroo women, they began to walk, and with every step they sang the world into being. Their journeys sculpted the land. A serpent's track became a river. A resting place became a mountain. A fight left a scar, and that scar is a canyon now. Every rock, every waterhole, every tree is there because of an event in a song. This isn't a story about the past, it's the eternal present, a continuous creation, and these creation songs have a practical function. They are maps. Songlines or dreaming tracks, each song is an itinerary, a lyrical route across the country. To know the song is to know the way. The melody and rhythm hold precise information. Where water is, what plants you can eat, how animals behave, what landmarks to look for. A single songline can stretch for hundreds of miles, thousands even. Crossing different language groups. As the song passes from one group to the next, the language changes, but the melody stays, the landmarks stay. It's a transcontinental navigation system, encoded in art. Imagine walking the central desert, one of the most unforgiving places. Your survival depends on finding water. You don't have a paper chart, you have a song. You sing the verse about the rainbow serpent. The melody describes the curve of a dry riverbed, the shape of a rock formation, and then, where the verse dips to a low note, you know to dig. There, under the sand, is a hidden soak. The song doesn't just tell you where the water is, it tells you the story of how the rainbow serpent put it there. The geography and the sacred narrative are inseparable. One gives you the physical fact, the other gives you the reason, the meaning, the law for how to care for that place. That makes the songlines perhaps the most profound integration of legend and geography ever developed. The journey of the ancestors isn't a one-time event to remember. It's an eternal path to walk and re-sing. By singing the songs, by walking the tracks, people maintain the world. They keep the creation alive, and they pass on with flawless accuracy, a survival manual for a continent. The songs encode seasonal knowledge. When fruits ripen, when animals migrate, they mark ceremonial sites. They describe social boundaries. They are a living atlas. An atlas where every page is a verse, every coordinate is a note in a melody carried for over 60,000 years. This tradition shifts how we view a map. It's not a separate object you consult, it's an action you perform. The map is the journey itself, sung into being with every step. The fantasy of a giant serpent carving the land is the spiritual truth. And the meticulous, life-saving directions inside that story are the geographic record. It proves the most enduring guides are woven into how we understand our world. The dreaming songs carry a continent's memory, but now we're listening with new ears, with machines that can see through sand and water. The legends gave us clues. And now modern technology is giving us proof. It's a quiet revolution in labs on satellite feeds. For the first time, we can test the geography of these stories with hard data. The results are startling. They show the core of many myths isn't fantasy. It's observation, preserved in story for thousands of years, waiting for us to learn how to read it again. Think about the tools we have: satellite imagery that shows ghostly outlines under farmland, under desert, LiDAR, lasers from planes mapping the ground beneath jungle canopy, revealing the grids of lost cities, geomagnetic surveys detecting disturbances in the Earth's field, pinpointing where fires burned, where structures stood. These aren't just for finding temples, they're being used to follow legendary routes. A team studying the Odyssey might feed Homer's sailing directions into a mapping system. They model ancient sea levels. They were different. They calculate travel times for Bronze Age ships against known winds and currents, and the fantastical journey starts to resolve into a series of plausible, real-world stops. That island of the Lotus Eaters, it's not just a metaphor. It emerges as a specific coastal region, a climate for soporific plants, a place where ships could be trapped by seasonal winds for weeks. The technology doesn't prove the Cyclops was real, but it can show the cave-ridden coastline described fits a real location perfectly. It turns the epic from a fairy tale into a distorted sailing log. This validation is even more dramatic on land. In Central America, LiDAR has peeled back the rainforest, revealing vast networks of Maya cities, roads, farmland. These discoveries often align with places held in local oral history, a story about a great city of the Snake Kings. Long dismissed, it gains new credibility when laser maps show a sprawling urban center exactly where the legend said it would be. The myth preserved the memory. The technology reveals the physical truth, or the Sagas. Researchers take a core sample of mud from a lake bottom in Newfoundland. They analyze the pollen trapped in each layer, a record of what grew over centuries. They might find a spike in certain non-native pollens, evidence of deforestation, right around the year 1000. This environmental data can corroborate the Norse sagas, the ones that describe clearing land and building settlements in Vinland. The story of Leif Erikson isn't just a written account anymore. It's written in the ecosystem itself. This shift does something profound. It builds a bridge between the humanities and the hard sciences. Historians and folklorists provide the stories, the ancient texts, the oral traditions. Geologists and remote sensing experts provide the tools to test them. Together, they reverse engineer the past. The hero's tale becomes a dataset that can tell us about ancient climate patterns, trade network resilience, the scale of human migration. It means we are no longer just interpreting myths. We are auditing them and finding, again and again, that their most enduring elements are grounded in a real witness to the world. The fantasy was the wrapper designed to survive. The geographic record inside is now being confirmed, point by the silent gaze of satellites, the precise measurement of lasers. We are learning our ancestors were not just storytellers. They were master cartographers who chose the most durable medium. They had the unforgettable narrative to ensure their maps would never be lost. The stories lasted because our minds are built for stories. That's the deepest thing. Our brains aren't filing cabinets, they're story engines. We think in narrative. We remember in narrative, and that's not just culture, it's neurology. If you take information and weave it into a story with a character, a challenge, a resolution, it becomes up to 20 times more memorable than a list of facts. A list of coordinates is fragile. It fades, but the image of a clever hero, blinded and furious, feeling over the backs of his own sheep to find the men hiding in his cave. That sticks, it sticks forever. In that one vivid scene, a whole set of geographic data gets locked in. The cave becomes a real coastal formation. The sheep become a method of evasion. The hero's panic becomes a warning. The story is a perfect mnemonic. This wiring explains something. It explains why cultures on every continent with no contact all came to the same solution. They faced the same problem. How do you preserve the most vital knowledge where the water is, where the danger is, how to get home across hundreds of generations? The answer was universal. You don't write a manual, you sing an epic, you turn the data into drama. A dangerous whirlpool isn't a note on a chart. It's the monster Charybdis swallowing the sea 3 times a day. That transformation works because it uses the brain's architecture. When a story gets tense, the amygdala lights up. That's the emotional center. It releases chemicals that flag the information as important. And the hippocampus, which is crucial for memory, weaves the sensory details into a robust network. The story gives the information context. It gives it emotion and sequence. It provides hooks, so many hooks, you can think of it as the ultimate memory palace. Instead of placing abstract items in rooms of a familiar house, an entire culture imagines a heroic journey and places its survival map along the path. Each strange creature is a landmark. Each divine intervention is a natural phenomenon. The conflict provides the emotional charge that makes it all unforgettable. That's how a Polynesian child could learn the star path to Tahiti from the legend of Maui. That's how a Greek sailor knew the perils of the Strait of Messina from the tale of Odysseus. The factual core was insulated, protected inside layers of character and plot. The legend was the shell, tough and enduring. The geographic truth was the seed inside. This psychological imperative turned every elder into a librarian, every parent into a teacher. By firesides on long voyages, the repetition of these stories did more than pass time. It performed cognitive maintenance, it rehearsed the map, it strengthened the neural pathways holding knowledge of currents, edible plants, safe harbors. The story made sure the map lived not on parchment, but in the living minds of the people who needed it. So when we see the accuracy in these ancient tales, it's not just clever encoding. We're seeing the most sophisticated memory technology our species ever invented, one that used the fabric of human consciousness as its storage medium. Sometimes a legend gets so big you have to test it yourself, not with instruments but with your hands. There was this Norwegian explorer, Thor Heyerdahl. He got fixated on a story from Polynesian tradition. They spoke of an ancestor, a sun priest named Kon-Tiki, who sailed from a distant land to the east. Most academics said that was impossible. The accepted theory was that settlement came from Asia, from the west, but Heyerdahl heard the legend as directions. He looked at the Pacific winds, the currents. The Humboldt Current comes up South America and turns west. The trade winds blow that same way, the story said east. The ocean seemed to say the same thing, so he proposed this radical idea. Maybe the first people to reach some islands came from South America, not Asia. It was a theory built on a story, on geography, on a belief in what ancient sailors might have known. To show it was possible, he decided to do what no modern person had tried. He'd build a raft exactly as the pre-Columbian people of Peru might have, using only what they had. Then he'd set sail and let the Pacific decide. He and a small crew built the Kon-Tiki from 9 big balsa wood logs tied with hemp rope. They gave it a simple square sail of woven bamboo. No metal, no engine, no modern navigation except a radio. In the spring of 1947, they pushed off from Peru. For 101 days, they lived on that small, creaking platform. They fished from the sea, they collected rainwater, they navigated by the stars like the ancient wayfinders. And the current carried them steadily west. They hit storms that washed over the deck. They saw marine life no one had seen from such a raft before. After more than 3 months, the raft crashed onto the reef of Raroya, an atoll in the Tuamotu Islands. They'd crossed over 4,000 miles of open ocean. They'd survived. The voyage was a feat of endurance, but the real meaning went deeper. Heyerdahl didn't prove Polynesians came from South America. Later, genetics and language showed their origins were in Southeast Asia, moving east. What the Kon-Tiki Expedition proved was more basic about the legends themselves. It proved the geographic and nautical knowledge inside such a story was perfectly sound. The journey described wasn't a fantasy, it was a viable route. The ancient peoples of South America had the materials, the understanding of currents, the courage to make that crossing. A legendary voyage from the east wasn't just a mythic memory. It was a geographic possibility that blurred a line. It made historians and archaeologists rethink what ancient peoples could do. If a balsa wood raft with a bamboo sail could cross the Pacific, then the ocean wasn't a barrier. It was a highway that could have been used for migration, for trade, or for accidental drifts that then became epic origin tales. Heyerdahl's journey did something. It used a modern adventure to validate the ancient logic of a legend. It showed the stories weren't necessarily records of what did happen, but meticulous records of what could happen. They preserved not just a route, but the deep understanding of wind, current, and survival needed to try it. The Kon-Tiki Expedition became a new kind of map. A map written in action, in saltwater and balsa wood, that confirmed the oldest maps of all were written in story. The Kon-Tiki Expedition showed a deep respect for the logic in ancient stories. But that respect has to go beyond just academic interest. When modern science brings its tools to these traditions, it's stepping onto sacred ground. For the cultures that have carried these narratives for thousands of years, they aren't just folktales waiting to be validated. They're living knowledge systems. They're tied to identity, to law, to survival. Take the Aboriginal songlines. To a researcher with a satellite map, they're a precise navigational network. But to the communities that hold them, they're the heartbeat of creation itself. They're theology and history and practical science, all woven together. Walking a songline is an act of renewal. It's about maintaining the world. To reduce that to a set of geographic data, that's a misunderstanding. It's like taking the seed from the shell and throwing away the meaning that gave it life. The same goes for the Polynesian star paths. The chants of Maui, they aren't just memory aids for navigation. They're genealogies. They connect navigators to their ancestors, to the gods, to their responsibility as stewards of the ocean. The knowledge is holistic. It's not just about where to sail, but why to sail and how to care for the places you find. And that creates an ethical dimension to this whole process. Corroboration has to be collaborative. It can't be a one-way transaction where Western science discovers the truth in someone else's heritage. Real understanding comes from partnership. From listening to the knowledge holders first on their own terms, recognizing that their traditions have been accurate, sophisticated records all along, long before the compass or the satellite. This collaborative reframing changes the conversation. We move away from trying to prove myths true. Instead, we step into recognizing different, equally valid forms of scientific and historical record. It leads to a more inclusive view of human intelligence, that our species has always been observant, adaptive, that we've developed multiple, elegant systems for encoding our understanding of the world. Some wrote on clay tablets, others wove knowledge into epic poetry, others sang it into the land itself. The goal isn't to take these stories and claim them for a single, dominant narrative. The goal is to expand our collective sense of how knowledge works, to see that a legend isn't the opposite of a map. It can be its most resilient form. When we approach these traditions with that humility, we do more than unlock secrets of the past. We build bridges to a more respectful future, where many ways of knowing can guide us together toward a deeper understanding of this planet we've all been charting for so long. The stories of Earth's past are becoming blueprints for the future. We're at the edge of a new ocean now, an ocean of stars, and we're already writing its first legends. Our modern Argonauts, they don't sail on wooden ships, they ride pillars of fire. The Apollo missions with their heroes, that journey to a distant, luminous world, it's transcended history. It's entered the realm of myth. Think of that image, Earthrise over the lunar horizon from Apollo 8. That wasn't just a photograph, it was a revelation. A new perspective on our home, delivered by a story of incredible daring. And the words spoken from that grey surface, they're our epic poetry, one small step. It's as concise, as powerful as any line from Homer. These events aren't just entries in a technical manual anymore. They're chapters in a story we tell ourselves. A story about courage and curiosity. They're the foundational sagas for a spacefaring age. And this is only the beginning. The planned voyages to Mars, that's the next great narrative. We can already see its outline, the long journey through the void, the perilous descent through a thin, alien atmosphere, the first boot prints in red dust. That will be our Odyssey, a saga of survival against a hostile environment. The red planet becomes our new island of trials. Every technical challenge, radiation shielding, growing food, extracting water, it gets transformed in the retelling. They become the monsters and marvels of the tale. A malfunctioning rover isn't just a systems failure, it's a fallen companion. The first successful habitat isn't just engineering. It's a sanctuary won against the odds. This raises a question for the deep future. 1,000 years from now, 10,000, how will these missions be remembered? The technical schematics for a Mars lander, they might be lost, digital decay, but the story of the first human beings to cross the interplanetary sea and walk its deserts. That story endures, it gets simplified, amplified. Its heroes become larger than life. The precise data from our probes, the coordinates of Olympus Mons, the minerals in a dry riverbed that might fade from common knowledge. But the legend of climbing the tallest mountain in the solar system, or searching for the ghosts of ancient waters, that carries the truth forward. The myth becomes the vessel for the map. We're watching the ancient pattern unfold. We take the hard, factual truths of our exploration and we wrap them in narrative. Our spacecraft are the named heroes. Their journeys are the quests. The planets are the legendary islands on a star chart we're only now learning to read. The data streams from the Perseverance rover, that's our sailor's log. And we're already crafting its adventures. We speak of its discoveries as if it has intention. Perseverance in the face of adversity. We anthropomorphize a machine because that's how we understand epic journeys. Through character, so as we look to the stars, we aren't leaving storytelling behind. We're fulfilling its oldest purpose. We're creating the accurate geographic records of tomorrow today. And we're encoding them in the only form guaranteed to survive the centuries, in a story. A story so compelling, so full of human aspiration, that it gets told and retold long after the specific chemical formulas are forgotten. The fantasy of a green Mars might be the shell, but the meticulous record of our first tentative steps onto another world, that's the profound truth held inside. Waiting, our new mythology is being written in rocket exhaust and radio signals, a celestial songline for the age to come, the cedar forests of Gilgamesh. The songlines of Australia. We've always walked a world where every legend was a map. These stories were never just fiction. They were libraries. They were survival manuals. Long before satellites, before printed charts, the most reliable way to preserve a coastline was to turn it into a monster. A safe mountain pass became a hero's narrow escape. An island rich with copper was remembered as a garden of golden apples. It was a universal human technology. It used the architecture of our own minds, our love for character, for conflict, to safeguard the data that meant life or death. The fantasy was the durable shell. The geographic record was the precious seed inside, and seeing the truth inside these journeys, it gives you more than trivia. It gives you a new lens for human history. Ancient migrations stop being arrows on a map. They become epic sagas of discovery, encoded by the people who lived them. Trade routes light up. They become the paths of Sinbad, of Jason. Environmental cataclysms, the flooding of a coast, the eruption of a volcano, they're not in scientific abstracts. They're in the visceral memory of a sinking city, a mountain of fire. This perspective bridges things. It connects the folklorist and the geologist, the historian and the oceanographer. It shows us our ancestors weren't primitive. They were profound observers, masterful information architects. They turned their world into a story so compelling it would outlast empires. So the next time you hear an old tale, a hero sailing beyond the sunset, a people wandering a desert guided by a pillar of cloud, listen closer. You're not just hearing a myth. You might be hearing the faint echo of a real explorer's logbook, a sailor's warning about a current, a survivor's account of a lost homeland, preserved for millennia in the only language timeless enough to carry it. The language of epic